Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. Guess who's back? I'm Bastani. Joining me this evening is Kieran, Andrieu. Kieran, how are we? We were talking about things just before you started. It's a Greek name, right? But you're not Greek.
It's not a Greek name as far as we're aware. It's a French name as far as we're aware, but the ancestry could very well be Greek. Maybe I should do some. Maybe I should do some genealogical work.
Coming up on tonight's show, the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon is creaking at the seams. The Metropolitan Police Service arrests several Kurdish activists, and net migration appears to have drastically fallen. Vladimir Putin has threatened to use Russia's new hypersonic ballistic missile, the Oreshnik, to turn targets in Kyiv to dust, as his forces use cluster munitions against Ukraine's energy infrastructure on Thursday. Those were just some of the more than 200 missiles and drones that were fired by Russia earlier in the morning. In Kyiv, the barrage of missiles forced residents to take shelter in the city's metro system. One mother told reporters this: "Our mornings begin with checking the phone to see if there is an air alert. I have to take the eldest daughter to school. We saw that there was an air alert and went to the metro. What do we think about all this? We are indeed fed up with all of it." The attack also left more than 1 million households without power. That's according to Ukrainian government reports. Moscow has frequently targeted Ukraine's power grid, and the country is expected to struggle to cope with demand over the winter. About half of Ukraine's energy capacity has been destroyed over the past 3 years. And in recent weeks, Ukrainian officials have suggested Russia maybe stockpiling missiles in order to launch coordinated strikes on the country's remaining power infrastructure and send it over the edge. Putin mentioned the potential use of Oreshnik missiles in response to Ukraine using Western long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russia. Those projectiles included Storm Shadow missiles donated by the British government. Speaking in Kazakhstan, Putin said this: "At present, the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff are selecting targets to hit on Ukrainian territory. These could be military facilities, defense and industrial enterprises, or decision-making centers in Kyiv." The Russian president added that the Oreshnik missile, first deployed by Moscow last week in a strike on Dnipro, could destroy even highly protected underground sites, with the missile now in mass production. Those threats come just days after Ukraine closed its own parliament on Friday because of a reported missile threat. Ukraine's parliament building is, of course, located in Kyiv's now heavily guarded government quarter. That's along with its cabinet offices, the presidential administration, and the Ukrainian National Bank. Specifically asked if such technology could be used against political targets, Putin said everything was on the table, citing an old Soviet joke. During his appearance in Astana, Putin also touched on the Russian Federation's potential response if Ukraine was to pursue and acquire nuclear weapons. He said this: "If the country which we are essentially at war with now becomes a nuclear power, what do we do? In this case, we will use all, I want to emphasize this, precisely all means of destruction available to Russia. Everything. We will not allow it. We'll be watching their every move." Pretty emphatic. Everything. He means, by the way, for people not paying attention, nukes. Kieran, are we looking at the end game in Ukraine now? Russia is looking to repeatedly use supersonic, hypersonic weapons, ICBMs. These were never used by anyone in a live military conflict ever, as I understand it, until last week by Russia in Ukraine. Really significant step, right?
Massively significant. And the human cost here is the thing we ought to be considering at all times. And it's horrific and it's considerable. And there is, at the moment, no end in sight. I don't know, Aaron, whether it signals endgame. I'm not a military expert. I think in many respects, military experts have seen their predictions defied. I remember at the outset of this terrible grinding war, there were many predictions that Putin had overshot, that he'd overstretched himself, that his political capital domestically had been overestimated by his supporters, etc., and that he was that this ultimately signaled the death knell for him. Unfortunately, predictions which have all been shown to be in vain. What I would say is, generally speaking, so I don't know if this is endgame or not. What I do think is that this was all, unfortunately, terribly predictable. Two things are true here and have been true here throughout. One is that Putin has committed war crimes. That's very obvious. That he, generally speaking, is a malevolent actor who wears the costume of many grim ideologies as it suits him and to shore up his domestic power. And also that Ukraine has a right to resist its occupation. Nonetheless, and at the same time, it's also equally been true that NATO and the West generally really has, and excuse my language, fucked Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in so doing has fucked Ukraine in the process. I'm not going to go into it in loads of detail, but two examples of choice. The neoliberal shock therapy that was introduced to Russia in the 1990s and very specifically led to the rise of Putin was passionately and enthusiastically cheered on by the West. Not just cheered on, implemented in large part by the West. Really, really destroyed the institutions of the country. Any inheritance that the Soviet Union left to Russia, it was dissolved in that process of neoliberalization. Second thing, NATO expansion. I know this is often repeated, but NATO expansion all the way to Russia's borders. Again, it's almost a cliche now to say it if you have any kind of dissenting position on this. It was not wise statecraft, in my view. And I think, unfortunately, that's been borne out in the fullness of time. So, now we find ourselves in a situation in which many Western politicians, including many of our own in this country, have painted themselves into a corner on this issue because it was politically expedient to make Ukraine a totemic issue. And Zelensky has been very effective at securing weapons and money. In many respects, fair play to him. That's what we expect him to do. But we're now in a third grinding year of stalemate in this war, with no seeming light at the end of the tunnel. And so I do think that at this juncture, whether it's endgame or not, it's absolutely imperative that there is a less totemic and more honest appraisal of the situation as a precursor to intensive diplomatic solutions.
I think that's really well said. At the start of all of this, I did think it was weird. People were donating clothes, and one trade union in this country even gave a vehicle to the Ukrainians. And I'm thinking, Russia has ICBMs. Russia has 5G fighter jets, right? It has a massive industrial capacity by comparison. It is the world's leading energy superpower. It will win this fight if it really goes all in. That may come at huge domestic cost. They may lose many lives. They may crash the economy. By the way, actually, a lot of that was really overemphasized. I suspect the longer it goes on, the worse it will be. Russia's had a really good year in terms of its GDP growth because it's operating, all guns blazing. Literally, it's moved to a war economy, full mobilization of the resources at its disposal, whether that's human, whether that's energy, or whether that's capital. But you can't do that forever when you look at interest rates, when you look at inflation. They cannot do what they're presently doing for 3, 4, 5 years more, would be my submission. But in any case, Ukraine could never win this war. They could never win this war. And the support they were getting, as far as I understood, made sense to negotiate some kind of a peace, which was at least somewhat advantageous to them. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm not going to tell them what part of their country they should give up. But that was the only way it ever made sense. The idea that Ukraine was going to push back into Russia, as some people were histrionically saying at certain points over the last several years, it almost defies belief. And the level of misinformation in regards to this whole conflict is just on another level. Even now, in 2024, it's almost 2025, I see comments on social media saying, how's Russia managed to do this? It only has a GDP the size of Spain or Italy. GDP on the measure that matters by PPP, when you measure the size of the economy using its own domestic currency, which you should do with Russia. They don't need to import very much. They've got lots of energy, lots of food. They make all their arms at home, or most of them at home. By that measure, it's the world's fourth largest economy. And of course, that's how you explain its ability to prosecute this kind of war. A country whose economy is the size of Spain's or Italy's clearly couldn't do this. But we still see so much misinformation, poor information. I think actually intentional ignorance is a better word. Just because you want something to be the case doesn't mean it is. And as I've said before, those weapons used by Russia over the course of the last, 10 days, we saw it last week, those weapons being used for the first time. Some people might be saying, well, they're new weapons. Of course, they've never been used before. ICBMs are not new weapons, so to speak. They've been around effectively. The technology has existed for them since 1944. Okay? The point is they're now being used actively in a conflict by a nuclear-armed state against another country. This is wholly new territory, and we don't have a political class or a media actually relaying quite how new all of it is. Barely 36 hours have passed since Israel and Hezbollah agreed a ceasefire over Israel's invasion of Lebanon, and it may already be crumbling. A few hours ago, the IDF posted this. A short time ago, terrorist activity was detected at a facility of the Hezbollah terrorist organization with medium-range rockets in southern Lebanon. The threat was thwarted by a fighter jet attack. The IDF is deployed in southern Lebanon, acting and thwarting any violation of the ceasefire agreement. And earlier today, the IDF said this. In the past hour, a number of suspects were observed arriving, some of them in vehicles, to several areas in southern Lebanon, which constitutes a breach of the agreement. IDF forces opened fire at them. IDF forces deployed in the southern Lebanon area are enforcing any breach of the ceasefire agreement. According to one Lebanese MP, a member of Hezbollah's political party, the people fired upon were not Hezbollah fighters. The Israeli enemy is attacking those returning to the border villages. There are violations today by Israel, even in this form. Now, that claim seems to accord with the testimony of returning Lebanese civilians in a number of cities and towns in southern Lebanon. It also accords with footage shot by Al Jazeera Arabic. This was the moment their journalist had to stop a broadcast under gunfire in the town of Kyiv.
وإطلاق النيران مستمر على حتى فرق الدفاع المدني التي تحاول الوصول إلى هذه المنطقة. علينا سنوقف عمليا الهواء الآن لنغير المكان الذي نحن متواجدون فيه.
Now, all this might look like a ceasefire breach to you or me or anyone remotely sensible. But Dropsite News has an interesting report on conditions favourable to Israel that US President Joe Biden is alleged to have allowed to be built into the deal. According to the report, the text of the deal prevents Hezbollah from carrying out, quote, any operations against Israel. Any. So far, so normal. However, it also gives Israel a loophole stating that the country will refrain from, quote, any offensive military operations against Lebanese targets. Kareem Makdisi, professor of international politics at the American University in Beirut, told Dropsite this. It's kind of a bit insidious where they say offensive, meaning somehow there's this little kind of wiggle room for what they will interpret as defensive, which in Israeli logic and discourse and action means anything. Anything can happen. They can say, well, this is defense. Even the genocide in Gaza, as far as they're saying, is defensive. That genocide is still happening. And that was the moment a missile hit a residential building in Nuseirat, a refugee camp in central Gaza. At least 9 people were reported killed in that strike. And Al Jazeera reports the Nuseirat strike was only one part of a wave of attacks, with its correspondent in Gaza saying this. We can confidently say that the entire Gaza Strip has been bombed equally since the early hours of this morning. we can still clearly hear the sound of the fighter jets flying at a very, very low level across the central area of Gaza and Deir el-Balah city. Reports were received from the northern part of the Strip, particularly from Jabalia and the city of Beit Lahia. These fighter jets carried out deadly attacks that destroyed the remaining residential buildings in Jabalia refugee camp, Jabalia town, as well as the northern part of Beit Lahia project area and Beit Lahia city. Kieran, the devil is in the detail with lots of things, and that seems to include ceasefire agreements. What do you make of this claim that Hezbollah are effectively are signed up to a profoundly different set of conditions to the IDF, and that in reality, the IDF haven't actually signed up to a ceasefire at all?
Well, it doesn't surprise me at all when I'm very depressed to be proven right on it. I think I haven't looked at the specificity of the ceasefire agreement in loads of granular detail, right? That's the first thing to say. But I strongly suspected and feared that it wouldn't be worth the paper that it's written on, not because I think all attempts to secure a ceasefire are futile and that we should just give up and duke this out militarily. Absolutely not. I think that it's worth trying to secure a genuine ceasefire in any situation because civilian suffering is so extreme, obviously. But because Israel now believes, and I think it's proven routinely correct in this assumption, that it can act with virtually absolute impunity. And so when you have a situation like the ICC, and these two things I don't think are coincidental, the ICC, the highest court in the world, issuing arrest warrants for the Prime Minister and the then Defense Minister of Israel. And then you have the United States saying that they not only will they not comply with it at ICC level, but the ICC itself ought to be sanctioned for arriving at this decision. You've got former leader of not the leader of the opposition, sorry, but you've got a high-ranking member of the formal opposition in this country saying that the ICC needs new leadership. And you've shamefully, in recent days, you've got France saying, trying to come up with some cod coverage for Netanyahu, saying that because he's in situ or serving or whatever, he himself has impunity. Of course, Israel thinks that it can act with perfect impunity under those circumstances. And of course, with rhetoric like that flying around at the highest levels, it's going to be proven correct in that assumption. So ultimately, I'm not surprised. I think this is all a function of a failure failure of the international community to prosecute its professed values. There's only so long that you can publicly abuse and mistreat your professed sacred cows before people start to realize that you don't really regard them as sacred at all, and then act accordingly. So I think it was only a matter of time. It hasn't taken very much time at all. Perhaps I was expecting it to be a little bit longer, but I don't know why I expected anything other than it happening swiftly. And here we are.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. There was a great show last week with Michael and discussing this ICC stuff. Clearly, it doesn't really mean very much to the French, to the British too. And you had this really remarkable excerpt where someone was saying, look, the ICC, you're undermining its credibility to do what it's really meant to do, which is, of course, arrest Africans and go after Putin, maybe the occasional Eastern or Central European, maybe. But it's not meant to arrest or pursue Israelis or Western Europeans or never, a North American. Let it do its job. That's not what its job is. That's a critique of it. That's what its opponents say it does. But these people can't help themselves. They let the cats out of the bag. Meanwhile, protest in Britain against Israel's genocide in Gaza continues. Great to see. And that was a demonstration today outside the Foreign Office in London, where protesters were taking part in the International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian people, as well as a National Day of Action called by the Trades Union Congress, the TUC. Britain continues to send arms and parts to the Israeli military, with demonstrators calling for an immediate arms embargo. The Metropolitan Police have arrested 7 Kurdish activists in dawn raids in London. 5 men and 2 women were detained at separate addresses during dawn raids in the capital on Wednesday, and they remain in police custody. In response to the arrests, protesters mobilised. On Wednesday night, there was a protest outside the community centre itself, with large numbers of people turning out to prevent further raids in Haringey, that's in North London. The police showed up in force as well and arrested 4 further people on suspicion of support for a prescribed organisation, assaulting an emergency worker, making threats to kill, and a racially aggravated public order offence. Kurdish community groups have condemned the raids and arrests, and they released the following statement from an occupant of one of the raided households. I awoke suddenly at 2 a.m. and thought an earthquake had hit. The door of my house was smashed in and 15 balaclava-clad police officers appeared at the top of the stairs and jumped on my husband, brutally beating and then arresting him. Soon after, my 15-year-old son appeared and the police jumped on him and started beating him also. He and I screamed, telling them that he is a child, and then they stopped. In my more than 23 years living in Britain, I have never experienced anything like this. My entire family is shaken to the core, and my son is suffering terribly from the traumatic experience. The police won't even allow us to go home to retrieve his school uniform. I really hope those people get hold of a good compensation lawyer. Not that the Met care. The Met do this stuff, and at the end of the day, it's the dopey old taxpayer who has to pay for the compensation. They just carry on assailing people and beating them up and smashing their doors in. Police are also conducting investigations at the Kurdish community centre in Haringey and say it could be closed for up to 2 weeks. In response, Kurdish community groups have now issued the following demands. Kurdish Assembly demands 1. The immediate release of community members and a full explanation for their arrest. An end to the occupation of the KCC, that's the community centre, so that it can immediately resume essential community services. An end to the criminalisation of the Kurdish community, including the harassment of activists, the delisting of the PKK as a prescribed terrorist organisation, and meaningful UK contribution to a democratic peace process in Turkey, a public apology from the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London in his capacity as Police and Crime Commissioner for London, and a public affirmation of the inviolability of essential community spaces and services, as well as commitment to their maintenance and protection. All seems quite reasonable to me. Now, according to police, the initial arrests were made in connection with a counter-terrorism operation involving the Kurdish Workers' Party, also known as the PKK. The PKK is a proscribed organisation in the UK. A spokesperson for the Metropolitan Police's counter-terrorism unit has said this: I want to stress that today's arrests are targeted specifically at those we believe may be involved in suspected terrorist activity. We understand these arrests have caused some concern amongst certain local communities, particularly those in the Kurdish community. I want to reassure the community that our activity is being carried out to keep everyone safe from potential harm, including those within the Kurdish community itself. That's why we started allegedly hitting a 15-year-old kid. We're just keeping you safe. Earlier today, I spoke to Ida Kaiko, an organiser within the Kurdish Solidarity Movement and doctoral researcher at Royal Holloway. I began by asking her about the arrests of those 7 Kurdish activists.
During those raids, people were beaten by the police, piled on very aggressively, and also children who were in the residences at the time were also violently tackled to the ground by the police. People at the community centre were handcuffed and taken outside and made to wait in the rain while the police searched the community centre for several hours. Many of those people who have been arrested are community organisers who are well known in the community and locally in the area as well, who run fundraising activities, supplementary schools, and generally are involved in the running of the community centre and in community activities that are organised there. I think it's also important to note that these arrests are really unprecedented in that the Metropolitan Police has said that these are the result of a long-term investigation that has been conducted over, it seems, several years. Many of the people who were arrested yesterday have been targeted by border stops and surveillance over a period of, in most cases, many years, in some cases, several decades. So this is a huge escalation, but it's also part of an ongoing trajectory of repression and surveillance and monitoring that many of these people have been subjected to for a longer period of time.
So the PKK is a prescribed terrorist organization. I find that term, the law around it, just incredibly strange and arbitrary. A Home Secretary determines whether or not you can support this or that organization, but that's just where the law is right now. What are your thoughts about the application of the relevant legislation in this particular instance?
I think the first thing to say about counterterrorism legislation is that it's intentionally very vague and broad. So it gives the state the widest possible powers to use to target basically whoever they please. So the people who were arrested yesterday were arrested under a clause of the Terrorism Act 2000, which says that a police officer can arrest anyone that they suspect to be a terrorist. That's the wording of it. So it leaves everything up to the discretion and interpretation of police on the scene. Now, obviously, we know that the people who've been arrested have been specifically targeted, but we also have to understand that that is the nature and the role of counterterrorism legislation as part of state power. Counterterrorism legislation, especially in Britain, because it comes out of the policing of movements in the north of Ireland, decolonial movements there, and the intensification of the war on terror, the so-called war on terror, you might call it, has made counter-terror legislation a part of the state's function that allows it to basically target whoever it chooses. So the PKK has been prescribed in certain European countries in the 90s. It was prescribed by the EU in 2002. And that's a really important point because that's when we see the ramping up of the war on terror project globally. So the Turkish state has been pursuing a counterterrorism strategy in relation to the PKK for many decades. But this starts to be exported outside of Turkey in the 90s when Turkey's economic and military power is growing and its influence over states, particularly in Europe, and also on the United States through NATO is growing. So Turkey uses its diplomatic, economic, and military connections to really pursue counterterrorism as a strategy, not just in relation to the PKK, but in relation to the Kurdish population as a whole. And that is exactly because of the breadth of counterterrorism legislation and the role that it plays in a global project of security. Basically, the prescription of the PKK means that anyone who expresses a Kurdish identity, anyone who expresses not necessarily even any support of the PKK, but support for a liberated Kurdistan and a democratic solution in the region, is likely to be targeted by counterterrorism legislation at some point. And the British state has built up a particularly powerful counterterrorism apparatus, both in intelligence and policing operations, in part because of its colonial history of counterinsurgency. And that's why we're seeing this level of force and violence being brought to bear on this particular community.
That's such a useful piece of information. Obviously, anybody familiar with Haringey, North London, is perfectly familiar with the fact that there are many people of Kurdish heritage in that part of the world. Obviously, there's been a significant response by the community there. Could this precipitate a wider kickback from British Kurds and their allies, of course, more broadly, given, as you've already mentioned, the application of law, legislation, processes, the deployment of a whole apparatus, which many would view as really contrary to democratic values?
The question of, could this precipitate a wider movement should actually be phrased, should this precipitate a wider movement? And I really think this is the point where we have to look at counterterrorism as a strategy that is targeted not only at certain community groups, but also the left as a whole. The Kurdish Community Centre in North London is an important resource, not just for the communities in that area of London, but also for the left as a whole. And this is true for Kurdish spaces in general. The level of organization in the Kurdish movement means that it provides a really important infrastructural and political linchpin of left-wing organizing across a lot of Western European states where there's a big Kurdish diaspora. And we can see that the British state has previously, in various kind of reports and investigations, specifically singled out the influence and the prominence of the Kurdish movement as an important part of networks of left-wing organizing. So that's one aspect that we really need to be very aware of. The other part that I think it bears mentioning is that the powers of counterterrorism are increasingly targeted at environmental activists, at pro-Palestine activists, and anti-racist movements as a whole. And this is something that is not just happening in a UK context, but also across Europe, across North America. The label of terrorism and extremism, which is this, again, a kind of broadening of the legal terms and practices of counterterrorism, these are being applied to movements in a really, really broad way. And the narrative, as always, is that counterterrorism is a protection of democracy, that terrorism, as it is seen by the state, but we have to understand that state definitions of terrorism, again, are intentionally vague and really hard to pin down. But terrorism is defined as being antithetical to democracy. But actually, the measures that the state takes in counterterrorism are some of the most anti-democratic moves that the state system is making as a whole. So whether that's, incarceration, indefinite detention, for example, the people who've been arrested this week, because they are being held under counterterrorism powers, they can be held without charge for up to 2 weeks. So even though it has been over 24 hours since they've been arrested, which under normal circumstances would require them to have either been charged or released from custody, they are still being held. And they could be held in solitary confinement up to that 14-day mark. So this is just one example of the powers that the state has when it comes to counterterrorism, the powers that it has authorized itself to use in the name of defending democracy, when actually this is a really unparalleled power to trample on people's democratic rights, freedom of expression, and free speech. And this is really intentionally being broadened out to target left-wing and progressive movements, and we should expect to see more of this. The thing I would say is that I'm hoping that this will really galvanize resistance, not just in London, but across the UK. This is a problem that everyone who is concerned, not only with democracy and free speech, but actually progressive values that many of us hold really dear, all of us should be concerned about this direction of travel and be really aware of what it might mean for all of us down the line. This is not just an issue that touches the Kurdish community. This is not just an issue that impacts certain political diaspora groups. It's something that the state is pursuing very clearly, and they're articulating it themselves as something that they're concerned about. So if you look at the Wolny report, for example, which is not specifically about counterterrorism, but political extremism, they are identifying these different networks of left-wing groups that they are specifically saying are a threat to democracy, are a threat to the state, and must be met with harsher and harsher measures of policing. And counterterrorism gives the state the widest possible powers to do that. So to expect that they wouldn't use those powers would be incredibly naive.
Britain's been accused of effectively carrying out these kinds of operations on the behalf, maybe even the request of Turkish authorities. Can you talk a little bit more about that? You touched already upon the sort of growing geopolitical weight of Turkey over the last 20 years, how that's translating to greater influence in these domestic policing operations and domestic policy in other European countries. But is this the leading edge of something bigger, or actually are we seeing merely the continuation of perhaps less conspicuous actions by the police in years past?
This is a continuation. The Kurdish community specifically has been targeted by counterterrorism, but also other forms of policing for as long as there's been a politically active Kurdish diaspora community in the UK. But this is also, we have to recognize that this is a huge escalation. The community center has been closed for 2 weeks. People who live in the homes that have been raided have been banned from entering those premises for 2 weeks. One of the children in one of the families living in an address that was raided was not only tackled to the ground, but also forbidden from retrieving his school uniform so that he could attend school the next day. The level of police brutality that we've seen directed at the Kurdish community in the last 48 hours is an enormous escalation. And in order to understand the context in which that's happening, we have to bear in mind what I've said so far about counterterrorism and the British state's particular commitment to pursuing counterterrorism as a mode of power. But also we have to understand the role of Turkey and how that is something that the Turkish state is increasingly using to its own benefit to pursue its own security goals through influencing NATO, influencing the United States, and influencing various kind of economic and political allies that it has in Europe. So as the war in Ukraine continues, as we're in this moment of, discussing the kind of power shifts of the world, how is the United States going to defeat the threat of China, defeat the threat of Russia as growing powers? While that is one of the main geopolitical concerns globally, Turkey will be able to leverage the power that it has, the geographical position that it has, and the military capacity that it has to basically require other states to carry out criminalization on its behalf. But that's not the only thing that we should be looking at when it comes to Turkey, because I think we have to, again, understand that progressive forces in the world, such as the Kurdish movement, are one of the main threats to a capitalist state-led system as a whole. So the Kurdish movement is proposing and creating alternatives to an oppressive system by implementing basically a form of self-governance based on direct democracy, women's liberation, and social ecology. And that's happening in Kurdistan, and that's a hugely attractive prospect to a lot of people. So when we're looking at the reasoning behind targeting the Kurdish movement, it is actually an assault on those principles, just as much as it is, the enactment of state power through these kind of geopolitical reasonings.
The Office for National Statistics has released its net migration figures for the year to June 2024. And while migration has fallen by 20% on 2023's figures, that's not the statistic dominating the headlines. Rather, it's that net migration into UK was even higher in 2023, already the highest year on record than previously thought. That's after the ONS updated its figures anyway. The update is a result of the ONS changing the way it records and estimates migration figures and includes better analysis of the number of people arriving in the UK from outside the EU, as well as new data on refugees from the war in Ukraine. So, what are the figures today? According to the ONS's revised figures, just over 900,000 people migrated to the UK in the year to June of 2023. That's net, to be clear, meaning it's the change in the size of the population once you also factor in the number of people who left the country. The previous figure had been around 740,000 for 2023. Meanwhile, the figure for the year to June this year is 730,000. So net migration is falling. And the ONS says that fall is likely to continue. But the upshot is that over just 2 years, a net total, and this is an amazing figure, of more than 1.6 million people have arrived in the UK net. That's around 2% of the population of the UK. That doesn't just sound like a lot, it is a lot. But the real question is this: is it a problem? And if it is, why? Keir Starmer seems to think so anyway. He's really not happy about this kind of immigration into the UK, and he was happy to point the finger at the previous government.
Now, the Independent Office of National Statistics has conducted vital work on the state of immigration and found the previous government were running an open borders experiment. As the ONS sets out, nearly 1 million people came to Britain in the year ending June 2023. That is 4 times the migration levels compared with 2019. Time and again, the Conservative Party promised they would get the numbers down. Time and again, they failed. And now the chorus of excuses has begun. We heard that from the leader of the opposition yesterday. But what we didn't hear, what the British people are owed, is an explanation. Because a failure on this scale isn't just bad luck. It isn't a global trend or taking your eye off the ball. No, this is a different order of failure. This happened by design, not accident. Policies were reformed deliberately to liberalise immigration. Brexit was used for that purpose, to turn Britain into a one-nation experiment in open borders.
Is this Donald Trump? Right? A one-nation experiment in open borders. This is like Trump talking about Biden, but it's Keir Starmer talking about Boris Johnson. And if you look at the historic context here, it's kind of true. It's unprecedented. Britain didn't have open borders, but it's still a really remarkable outlier after 2021. There's no denying that net migration of 1.6 million people over 2 years is a jaw-dropping figure. But to understand what's really happening, we need more than sound bites. We need to dig a little deeper. And of course, as you all know, that's when Novara Media comes in. So let's start by looking at where people are coming from. In 2023 and 2024, almost all net migration was a result of people coming to Britain from outside the European Union. But that wasn't always the case. Before the EU referendum in 2016, EU nationals were the largest cohort of migrants, peaking at just over 300,000 in 2016. After the referendum, those figures declined, with more EU citizens starting to leave the country than arriving by around 2021. That's also the year that net non-EU migration reached previous levels of EU migration, hitting around 300,000. To put it another way, by 2021, 3 years ago, non-EU migration was replacing migration lost from the EU post-Brexit. But between 2021 and 2022, migration from non-EU countries begins to soar in the wake of the pandemic. So why is that? Well, let's look at why people are coming to the UK from outside the EU. Let's start in particular with students. The biggest growth in non-EU migration has been caused by foreign students, with 220,000 arriving in 2023. That compares to just 45,000 in 2021. And in 2021, 14,000 visas for student dependents were granted. By 2023, that number had reached 107,000. Put another way, in 2021, 1 in every 3 students brought a dependent. But 2 years later, that figure was around 1 in 2. Now, last year, the Tory government brought in a ban on visas for the dependents of many students. And it's seen the number of dependent visas almost half in a year. But it hasn't massively affected the number of students getting visas full stop, with a drop off of just 20,000 over the last 12 months. And for universities anyway, that's a good thing, because our universities have now structured themselves to be totally reliant on lucrative international fees. You don't have to agree with that. You don't have to think it's smart. I certainly don't. But we are where we are. In August, the chair of the Office for Students begged the government to lift visa restrictions amid fears that without them, some universities would face bankruptcy. It's also worth noting that the Office for National Statistics counts anyone staying in the UK for a year or more in their net migration figures. But of course, most students leave the country after their course, with only between 15 and 25% staying long term. That's according to Oxford's Migration Observatory. The next largest area is work visas. In 2021, just 30,000 non-EU migrants arrived on work visas, bringing another 30,000 dependents with them. In 2023, however, 170,000 migrant workers arrived from outside the EU, bringing around 150,000 dependents with them. That's really extraordinary. But according to the Migration Observatory, those 2023 figures for non-EU workers and their dependents, around 400,000, is still less than EU work migration in 2016, which is around 500,000. So it seems a pretty plausible theory that what we're seeing here in regards to work is the replacement of one kind of migrant worker with another in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. In other words, whereas nursing homes, wards, and social care teams were staffed with people from Eastern Europe before 2020, or particularly before 2016, now they're staffed with people from former colonies like India and various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, the right likes to make political capital about that. They like to talk about the demise of British values, the loss of British culture, except this is exactly what they wanted. And no, I'm not joking. Here's Reform UK leader and MP Nigel Farage back in 2015.
I do have a slight preference. I do think, naturally, that people from India and Australia are in some ways more likely to speak English, understand common law, and have a connection with this country than some people that come perhaps from countries that haven't fully recovered from being behind the Iron Curtain.
So as we've already seen, there's basically a one-to-one replacement when it comes to work visas of EU for non-EU. That's pretty clear. Again, you don't have to agree with it, you don't have to like it, but it's pretty clear that with regards to immigrant workers coming to the UK to work, actually in terms of the numbers, not much has changed. What has changed is that we've got non-EU nationals coming rather than EU nationals. You go to Pret-a-Manger in King's Cross and you'll see more South Asian people rather than Hungarians and Poles. And as you just saw there, that's precisely what Nigel Farage said he wanted before the Brexit referendum. That was the plan. That was the plan. The plan has happened. But now, of course, Reform UK's position is that things have changed. Did they want the status quo ante? Did they want what we had back in 2016? Was that better? That's a great question for Nigel Farage, right? Was it better before? In which case, why leave the EU? This was the argument you made to leave the EU. Maybe somebody should pull them up on that. Let's look at the next largest category in all this. That's refugees. In 2021, 10,000 people arrived in Britain on refugee schemes, with 9,000 of them from Hong Kong. In 2023, over 120,000 people arrived, with 70,000 of those people coming from Ukraine and most of the rest from Hong Kong. Obviously, the Ukrainian refugee scheme will result in a lot of returns, and the Migration Observatory predicts, based on the pattern of emigration following previous periods of migration, that most migrants on all types of visas will return to their countries of origin after a period in the UK. However, food for thought here with Ukraine, because in the event of total defeat to Russia, those numbers of people seeking asylum in the UK and of course elsewhere in Europe will probably rise much higher. Following the trend for high net migration following the COVID pandemic and the EU referendum, corresponding emigration down the line brings the UK back to net migration of between 300,000 and 400,000 a year. That's also the assessment made by the ONS. They predict net migration returning to around 315,000 by 2028. Kieran, these numbers are extraordinary, and I don't want people to think that I'm attacking migrants for saying that. This country builds around 100,000 homes a year. We don't really build very much infrastructure. We completely misallocate resources because of the nature of how we're governed, our economic system, et cetera, Could go on and talk about that for days. But clearly, given all that, having net migration of 1.6 million over 2 years, actually, I think over 4 years, something like 2.7 million. You're looking at something like 3.5% of the entire UK population. That is really, really something, isn't it? Particularly on the housing front. My question for you is, given all of this happened under the Tories, surely they'll be calling for Keir Starmer to resign.
Yeah, probably. It's like the fiscal conservatives, I think they call themselves, in the United States, or the deficit hawks, I think they favour, who always fetishize to the dollar the increase in the deficit in the United States, always failing to acknowledge that it was Reagan and Bush Jr. that increased the deficit the most. But I mean, there's a really serious set of points here, Aaron. I mean, the first is that actually that points to a key contradiction. All of this points to a key contradiction. You know, you mentioned Farage, Tories, Starmer. They're all, broadly speaking, to a greater or lesser extent, obsessives about the virtues and the values of market capitalism, free market capitalism. And especially as you get towards the end of the scale with the Farages of the world and the Tory party, it's a dogma for them. But what that doesn't really capture is the uncomfortable marriage between free market dogmatism on the one hand and nationalism on the other. If you want closed borders or you want to reduce immigration, so you would do pretty well to reduce the amount on which you are dependent on the global economy. The interdependence of the global economy guarantees, by capital or by investors, the allocation of labor from elsewhere. Because, for a very simple reason, the global economy and domestic economy in this country would collapse were it required to make do with labor that hails from these shores or from where you're doing your trading or you're producing, right? That's the first thing. I have to say more broadly, I think, Aaron, that, and I'm sorry to do the ABC of the left on this, but I really have yet to be convinced by anybody that migration, even historically high levels of migration, have ever actually been the root of a social problem or a series of social problems. Cosmetically, sure, but they're not the root, to my reckoning and by my reading of history. I'm happy to be persuaded otherwise if someone can do it. But almost invariably, it seems to me, migration, even unprecedentedly high levels of migration, have functioned as great developmental mechanisms for any society. Again, without which it seems quite plausible that most societies, at the point in which they absorb high levels of migration over periods of time, were it not for that migration, probably would have collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions, economic and so on. Billionaires who hoard tremendous amounts of wealth, corporations that rig the economic game to make sure that resources and assets are hoarded by an increasingly small number of individuals and entities. Those are the actors that create scarcity in our society. And of course, they have their enablers in the political class. Those are the underlying causes of scarcity in our society. And of course, in that situation, in that set of circumstances, and by the way, when you have a global economic system that's heavily rigged against the global south and creates migration through economic dislocation, unevenness, and of course, the war and environmental degradation that goes with it, when you put all that into a cauldron, into a mix, of course, you're going to have the conditions in which it becomes very easy for political entrepreneurs who believe in nothing, generally speaking, the likes of Enoch Powell, who, by the way, everybody remembers Enoch Powell was a virulent racist, rightly. Everybody forgets that he was also a very early, passionate champion of unfettered markets, free market ideology in this country. When you throw all of that together, of course, you create the conditions in which political entrepreneurs who believe in nothing can stoke fears, can act as effective demagogues for people who have seen their communities destroyed by economic dislocation and so on. I think that's more or less everything I want to say on it. I'm sorry I strayed slightly, but that broadly encapsulates how I feel about the question.
So let me just respond to that quickly, Kieran, because I don't want to appear to be saying that migration causes those issues, right? We need to build many more homes in this country. We need to build a ton of infrastructure. That's going to require skilled labor, and the skilled labor to do that will be coming from abroad. It will include people from abroad. You know, my conversation on Sunday, really great downstream with Gareth Dennis, he said the number one obstacle in terms of building new rail infrastructure in this country is engineers, it's people. We don't have enough people. So given we have more people dying than being born in this country now, we have a very low fertility rate. Guess what? You're going to have people from overseas come and help us build that stuff and build the homes. But in 2023, Kieran, in 2024, Britain isn't building stuff, right? For a bunch of reasons. We can say it's because people with asset wealth don't want the value of those assets to depreciate. So that actually, it doesn't really suit people with big valuable homes to have more homes being built, because of course that would mean a stagnation in property values in this country for probably 25 years, which by the way, we should probably have. We need it. I say that as a homeowner, the country needs that. But if your wealth is tied up in constantly appreciating assets and rents, you're not going to want to build more homes. So the sort of reality is we have 1.6 million people over 2 years. We're not even building, I think 300,000 new homes over that period. So that is just a simple fact of supply and demand. Now, if we did have quote unquote properly functioning markets, if we did have a state and a government that was committed to building social housing, below market rent housing, if we didn't have NIMBYs left, right, and centre, et cetera, in a perfect world, of course, Britain could be building the housing stock to accommodate those people, as it did in the past, by the way. In the 19th century, Britain's population, I think, tripled, right? I don't think anybody says at the end of the Victorian era that housing was worse than it was at the start, right? People built a ton of infrastructure, new housing, et cetera, which met the needs of a much larger population. Of course, we could do that, but we aren't for a ton of reasons, primarily, as you've already pointed out, the nature of our economic system, how it privileges people with extraordinary wealth and who own really valuable assets. That's just the reality of it. And then I suppose a second point, Kieran, is this. Regional inequality is really bad and it's getting worse. And of course, you can map on to regional inequality people's sympathy for refugees or even just openness to migration, right? So in places that remain relatively high GDP, high productivity areas, southeast of England, but particularly Greater London, there's much greater support for migration than there is somewhere which, as you've already sort of touched upon, has lost out when it comes to globalization, technological innovation over the last 30, 35 years. There's a great story, by the way. Reform have five MPs. In 4 of the constituencies of those MPs, if you look at the transport infrastructure, they are literally missing a road. Great article about this I read earlier today. One of those constituencies, to get from the furthest part to the only hospital it had, I think takes you 90 minutes, right? So that is the experience of people in those constituencies. High regional inequality, crumbling public services, declining real pay, and then they see 1.6 million net immigration over 2 years. Now, we agree, not an issue, but when you have political entrepreneurs like Nigel Farage say, well, that is why you're experiencing the problems you are, it's pretty damn hard for somebody on the other side of the political sort of fence to say, well, actually, no, you're wrong, because you have to demonstrate how he's wrong. And like you say, the experience of the last 40 years is that people are getting poorer. So how do you counteract that quickly?
Well, a few points to make. I think, first of all, it's important to say that the ONS statistics do predict, or rather the ONS modelling predicts, that migration will come down for the rest of the decade in this country. So it is probably, as you've, I think, articulated, it's a moment rather than a general upward trend. Yeah, that's the first thing to say. I agree with all of your points about house building, infrastructure, and so on. But that points to a really fundamental thing, which is that it's incredibly depressing. And I know you would agree with, I'm sure you'd agree with this, Aaron, but it's incredibly depressing to hear Keir Starmer using the rhetoric of the far right and making a bête noire, or continuing to inflate the bête noire of migration, positing it as the cause of all of these ills, when we know that the underlying causes are the failure to build an economic system that works for most people, failure to grapple with environmental degradation, and failure to work with the international community to contain wars. And in fact, in all of those instances, we're not just failing as sort of passive bystanders, we're actually contributing to the prolonging of all of those problems, right? Very actively. So none of those things are going to get any better. None of those things are going to get any better so long as politicians bury their heads in the sand, perfect the ostrich maneuver, and so migration will continue to increase in defiance of those ONS statistics, or maybe in line with them, and then afterwards, if these things are not properly addressed. And so it just seems to me fundamentally very depressing that we're accepting that we don't go to address the causes. In other words, I think we should be using our platforms, and I know obviously we all on Novara tend to do so. I think we should be using our platforms to call out the bullshit. I mean, the Eric Kaufmans Eric Kaufman used to teach me, by the way. The Eric Kaufmans and the Matt Goodwins of the world would sooner die than admit any of these economic dimensions to any of this. Not because they don't know that they exist, actually. And I think I can say this with some confidence because I was taught by Eric Kaufman 12 years ago, but because it's not as lucrative as to say, yes, migrants are the principal cause, and there's a ethnic majority, and the ethnic majority will start to feel uncomfortable, etc. if you exceed a certain threshold. Another thing, briefly, Aaron, is you pointed to regional imbalances, rightly, absolutely rightly. But even there are very clear economic underpinnings. The government's dispersal program created market incentives to send large numbers of people, asylum seekers, refugees, and so on, to the poorest parts of the country. And the market incentive there was, where's the cheapest property? Because the Home Office is going to be paying, or some government department's going to be paying. So let's find the areas of the country with the lowest cost of housing and send people there, essentially, rather than a fair distribution of people across communities. I don't favour that. I favour a fair distribution. But then there's an adjoining point I just want to make very quickly, which is, and I think this remains true, statistically speaking, areas with higher levels of ethnic admixture and first, second generation migration tend to be the most liberal in their opinions in response to polling data and so on around the issue of migration. So if it were simply an issue of areas being flooded with migrants and native populations feeling uncomfortable, that probably wouldn't be reflected in the data in the way that it is.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, ahead of Brexit, people said that the constituencies most likely to vote Leave had the least migration, right? And that's true. But then if you look at secondary data, they also had the highest increase in migration over the preceding 5 to 10 years. Boston was a great example. I think that was like the most Levy place in the country. So both points of view are correct. It's a really interesting one. I'll just finish on this because, of course, we talked about Nigel Farage a few moments ago. How has nobody not landed a glove on this man? How? Bear in mind, he was the CEO, effectively, of the Brexit Party, the antecedent political body of Reform. Legally speaking, one is a continuation of the other. He had, I think, 9 out of 15 shares. He had most of the shares in Reform, and of course the Brexit Party. He decides unilaterally that they're going to back Johnson, right? They gave that majority to Johnson. If the Brexit Party runs in every constituency in the country, in 650 constituencies in 2019, the Tories get a majority of like 20, right? Nobody in the media wants to say this, of course, because then you don't get to bash Jeremy Corbyn. But it's true. That's the thing that really spiked Labour, was the Brexit Party contesting certain seats, but not others. That gave Boris Johnson the majority to then oversee record levels of migration into this country. So after Boris Johnson and the various people at the top of that government, the person most responsible for that arguably is Nigel Farage, who, as you saw a few moments ago, in 2015, said he would literally prefer people who are South Asian or from the West Indies to be working here as economic migrants rather than people from Eastern Europe, which is exactly what's happened. But actually, he doesn't want that. Like I say, how has nobody laid a glove on him? There is so much contradiction and doublespeak going on, and yet doesn't seem called out by much of the media. Do you remember this from the dying days of the Johnson government? For those listening on the podcast, that's Dame Andrea Jenkyns back in July 2022, giving the literal public the finger. Not exactly what one might expect from a parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Skills. Jenkyns was also the Conservative MP for Morley and Outwood from 2015 until this July, when she lost her seat in the general election. And she was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire last June as part of Boris Johnson's resignation honours from the previous year. So far, so conventionally Tory. But today, to the surprise of perhaps very few of her former colleagues, Jenkyns joined Nigel Farage's Reform UK, and she will now stand as the party's candidate to be Mayor of Greater Lincolnshire in May 2025. Here's what Jenkyns had to say about her former party. I was tempted before the general election, but I'm a loyal person to a party. I might not be loyal to prime ministers, as we've seen in the past, but I'm loyal to parties. And I believed, as I said, in going down with that ship fighting. I was elected as a Conservative, and I got knocked out as a Conservative. But I feel, unfortunately, the party has become tired. As mentioned, this move wasn't entirely unpredictable. Jenkyns had previously urged the Conservative Party to unite with Reform in order to prevent a Labour supermajority at the last general election. She also included a picture of herself with, guess who, Nigel Farage, on her campaign leaflet in July. That came after, the year before, publicly calling on Rishi Sunak, her then leader, to step down as Prime Minister. Reform also announced that they had surpassed 100,000 members today. That's a big accomplishment for any new party. 100,000 members have now joined our movement. You've got the fireworks there, proverbial and literal. And on top of that, in what was a pretty good day for Reform, you'd think, was them polling on 22%. That was according to one pollster, their highest share of the vote yet. As you can see, this is for Westminster general elections. Find Out Now UK. Data collection was until yesterday, the 27th of November. Greens up 2 on 9%, Lib Dems on 12%, Labour on 25%. Wow-wee. That is really, really extraordinary, right? That's 6.5% down on 2019, the worst result since the 1930s, remember? And the Conservatives, they're on 27, they're down 2. Interestingly enough, however, Labour, if that result was to happen in a general election, would still, quite possibly, have the most MPs in the House of Commons, although it would be quite close. So, 100,000 members, a defecting Tory MP, and the best polling yet for Nigel Farage's outfit. A great day for Reform, you'd think. But not so fast. That's because before Dame Andrea's announcement, Reform UK's former deputy leader, Ben Habib, said he was leaving the party. Here's a video he posted on X.
Good morning, folks. I got into politics to get Brexit done. I could see in 2019 that Theresa May simply wasn't going to deliver it, so I threw my hat in with the Brexit Party. And I stayed in politics because Boris Johnson, contrary to all his promises, didn't get Brexit done. The 2 deals he signed with the European Union left Northern Ireland behind, over 1 million British citizens thrown under a bus by his withdrawal agreement. And it also hitched the rest of the United Kingdom to the regulatory hip of the European Union, committing to staying in line with them on state aid, competition, employment, and environmental law. Yes, he committed us to the net zero target in international treaty with the EU. In that same agreement, he also committed us to staying in the European Convention of Human Rights, paying money into the European Defence Fund for the development of European military hardware and software, and a whole lot else besides. By no measure could that set of agreements be regarded as getting Brexit done. And this is a fundamental ideological difference between Reform UK and Nigel Farage on one side and me on the other. Nigel says that Brexit was done. It's just that we didn't take advantage of it. We didn't move far away enough from the EU in order to reveal the benefits of Brexit. But I completely disagree. I can't make any case for Nigel's position, and it's not just semantics. I can't make any case for it because Northern Ireland's been left behind. What kind of country are we if we don't fight for British citizens? We are knout if we're not prepared to stand for that fight. I also have concerns about Reform UK, then the Brexit Party, because of the structure of the party. As people will probably know by now, Reform UK Limited is a limited company. The political party is a limited company. It has 15 shares, 9 of which are owned by Nigel. And it was Nigel's control of that party, 60% control of that party, that enabled him to stand down 317 candidates in 2019 against Boris Johnson without any consultation of any of us in the party. And he may have had good reasons for doing so in his mind to prevent Jeremy Corbyn getting into office. But actually what we did was deliver Boris Johnson into office and deliver into being the withdrawal agreement, which has thrown Northern Ireland under a bus.
This is key. Ben Habib, right? A key player in the Brexit Party and Reform until today. Key player is saying they delivered Boris Johnson into office. The same Boris Johnson who oversaw 1.6 million net immigration over 2 years. But nobody will ask Nigel Farage about this. Habib also said he had ideological issues on migration, specifically that, unlike Farage, he backs mass deportations. Kieran, was this a good day for reform or not?
Every day is a good day for reform at the moment. And all the Ben Habib videos in the world aren't going to change that, especially ones of that quality. I thought the guy is supposed to be worth hundreds of millions, isn't he? People listening to this won't be able to see the video, but if you do watch it, I mean, it's flashing. It made me feel nauseous. Reform is in the perfect position, given what it is. It's perfectly poised and placed for an insurgent party from the right. They have a small number of MPs, not too many that they can't maintain discipline, but not too few that they can't make ripples and create, reverberations inside and outside of Parliament. They have very, very few responsibilities at the moment. Reform has very few responsibilities, very few liabilities. That's why you see Nigel Farage. I agree with you entirely about people not putting a glove on Farage, by the way, Aaron. Teflon coated, very, very, charismatic communicator. And that, I think, explains a lot of it. But generally, in many ways, a fuck up in accordance with his own principles and own strictures and measurements on the matter. You can see him swanning off to the United States for months or for weeks. I don't want to be hyperbole on the matter, but you can see him swanning off to the United States for weeks and returning. That's because he has basically no responsibilities whatsoever. His constituents, I don't know what they think about him. I don't know what they think about it, but I do know that it's a very good day for reform, and it will be for some time yet, I'm afraid to say.
I think it's pretty good. You're saying about what responsibilities do reform MPs have. I suppose, a lot of Labour MPs, all sorts of MPs. There are also some Tory MPs who are good at casework. They'll be trying to help their constituents with, disability access for somewhere, the council not helping them on something, business rates being done inaccurately by council officers, God knows what. 1,001 things. The reform MPs are just shopping for a new barber down on Regent Street. You can bet something that a lot of those barbers they were wearing at the recent farmers demo, they weren't very well worn, were they? Anyway, that's a little bit maybe below the belt, but that's just my read on it. You've been really great tonight, Kieran. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Aaron. Very serious topics, but I hope it's not too glib to say I've enjoyed myself.
I'm glad you enjoyed yourself. And I have to say, actually, before we go, you'll be hearing a lot more of this in the coming weeks, but Kieran is absolutely right about what's going on with Reform UK. They're going to shift the policy conversation so far to the right, in a similar way, by the way, to what happens with Jeremy Corbyn in this country after 2015. They're going to shift the policy conversation in a very different direction. You can see Keir Starmer in that slipstream already. And I think it's really critical that we have media, politicians, public-facing institutions making the argument for a different kind of politics. If you agree with that, if you support our work here at Novara Media, consider becoming a supporter. Go to novaramedia.com/support. The link should be in the description below. You can just give us a month's worth of, you can just give us rather a 1 hour's wage a month, so you work really hard, I'm sure. £10 an hour, £15 an hour. Maybe you could give us that as a direct debit once a month, or £1 a month, whatever you think is appropriate. We're in this for the long haul. We're under absolutely no illusions. I'm sure, like many of you, I'm beginning to price in actually a potential Reform Tory government in 2029. I don't think it's likely. There's still a really long way to go. As you've seen with Ben Habib, these guys are going to fall out a lot over the next 4 years. But it's gone from something I would have joked about and mocked at the time of the last general election to something which I think is now perfectly plausible. We here at Novara Media are part of a broader movement to stop that and to shift politics, the political conversation, in a better direction. I think we've done a very good job of that over the years. We're going to have to do an even better job going forward. Like I say, if you think you can help us do that, go to novaramedia.com/support. Finally, thanks to everyone for watching tonight. You know what I'm going to say next. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.